Well, welcome everyone. My name is Suzanne Moomaw, and I am the chair of Urban and Environmental Planning. I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you, community members, students, parents, I'm sure out there, but particularly to our Plavnik 2025 Plavnik lecturer, Professor Larry Bacow. You'll hear a lot more about him, but I want to begin my formal introduction with a disclaimer. Mark Twain once said that it embarrassed him when people complimented him because he never felt like they'd said quite enough. So in the case of Larry Bacow, it will never be enough because of the work that he has done and continues to do. So to say the least and the most, Larry's work and leadership have been honored throughout the world. The list of awards is way too long to read out right now. Most recently, though, we are very proud of this, he got the Martin Meyerson Award for Leadership in Higher Education from the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. So he is very much in our orbit. I want to give you a little bit about him, and then we are going into a little bit of an unusual format for us, but one I think will work very well. The depth and breadth of Larry Bacow's experience in issues we care about in this building and throughout the university, and the wisdom he brings to them cannot be easily measured or described. He has been and continues to be a leading light in issues around climate change, environmental resilience, immigration, and the importance of cities as beacons of hope and possibility. He holds an undergraduate degree from MIT Phi Beta Kappa and 3 degrees from Harvard, including a law degree, Master's of Public Policy, and a PhD. And of course, he was also an Eagle Scout. We could have guessed that. In our conversation tonight, when environmental challenges and development collide, Larry was the perfect person to ask. He was the Lee and Geraldine Professor of Environmental Studies in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, where he taught for 24 years. After that, or during that period, he served as, come on down, as Vanna might say, come on down. He served as chair of the faculty and chancellor at MIT, then president of Tufts University, and then president of Harvard. At MIT, he co-founded and was the first director of MIT's Center for Real Estate. He also co-directed MIT's Center for Environmental Initiatives. At Harvard, he established the Salatab Institute of Climate and Sustainability, and also the Harvard and Legacy of Slavery Initiative. That's just the tip of the iceberg. But I can think of no one in the world better to help us think through strategies, intersections, and solutions than Larry Bacow. We are so honored to have you at UVA and in the School of Architecture, and it promises to be a wonderful conversation. That's the lead in to the format. I have 3 areas that I will be asked lead questions on, and then we will turn it to you. So we will finish right at 6 o'clock with a reception right outside, but there will be time and a microphone for you to ask questions that we didn't cover. So the 3 are these. The first set of questions is about how we balance, evaluate, and minimize the impact of needed development on our natural systems and processes. The second, another area, a specialty of Larry's, the kinds of leadership and negotiation skills that planners need to be more proactive, and designers and architects, and effective in balancing the economy, the environment, and equity. And finally, the third question, why is immigration so critical to the long-term future and resilience of our cities? Think Emma Lazarus just a moment. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. We need to understand in the 21st century context what that means. So without further ado, Larry, here we go with you and me. So welcome again.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for an introduction which my father would have enjoyed and my mother would have believed. It's great to be with all of you.
So my first question is, you're probably one of the few people in the world who established both a real estate center and two centers of sustainability and climate resilience. Tell us about your thought process for both, why they are and are not at odds on their face, and where the natural and logical intersections are to build and develop sustainability.
So great questions. I'd like to sit here and tell you that there was a grand plan and how these things all happened to come together. But like most things in life, it was a confluence in some ways of fortuitous accidents. If I can be a little bit autobiographical. So I wrote my dissertation about collective bargaining over health and safety issues. Okay, and I was interested in OSHA had just been established. This is 100 years ago. Actually, it was in 1970.
Don't say, because we're too close.
Yeah, 75, something like that. 70, yeah, about that. Then I started working on it. And so I was interested in how we were going about regulating occupational safety and health, and specifically interested, if you know anything about the labor movement, how it got started. It originally was not to bargain over wages as much as it was to negotiate over working conditions of people who worked in sweatshops at the time. And so I was interested in how it was that we had migrated from, if you will, regulating occupational hazards, okay, through collective bargaining to saying, okay, now it's the responsibility of the government. When I had the opportunity to go to MIT to teach, it was actually to fill in for somebody who was on leave for 2 years. And I was the lowest of the low, 2-year non-tenure track terminal appointment. You got to leave when the person comes back. But I was filling in for somebody who was teaching courses in environmental policy. And when I was asked to do this, I said, what do I know about the environment? And somebody said to me, it was actually Larry Susskind, well, what's bad for you in a factory when it comes out of the stack is bad for everybody else. So that's sort of how I got into environmental issues initially. And then over time, I wound up writing about things that society needs and nobody wants to live next to, what we now know as NIMBYs, a term that was coined by my co-author. And that led me to thinking about ways of how do we cite these things which society really needs, whether or not we're talking about prisons or airports or hazardous waste facilities or public housing projects or other things. And so I thought a lot about that, wrote a book about that, and then realized that improving citing processes can only get you so far, but people are still going to argue about, do we need this? Why do we need this? Where is it supposed to go? And so I then focused my attention on resolution of environmental disputes and wrote a book called Environmental Dispute Resolution with a colleague at the time. All of this is a long way of saying that very early on in my career, I became interested in the intersection between how it is that we deal with human health and safety on the one hand, either at the micro or at the macro level, and how it is that we provide the kinds of things that society actually needs, but often come with social costs.
Right.
And so that's been at the core of my work from sort of day one. For those of you who are graduate students, most of us wind up rewriting the same paper over and over again. It's our dissertation. I used to tell my doctoral students, you never finish your dissertation, you just stop writing it, and then you rewrite it. And sort of in many ways, that's what I've done. And I've had these opportunities at various points to sort of think on a broader scale of how do institutions organize themselves to grapple with these challenges. So the Center for Real Estate comes about because from an economist perspective, real estate's actually the largest capital market in the world. But it's also true that after sort of art, literature, and music, our buildings are the most durable products of our society. They're going to be around. Look at where we're sitting, on the University of Virginia campus. Whoever invents this, there's going to be a new one in a couple of years. But our buildings are with us forever. So we make decisions that affect generations over centuries. And so how do we do that? And how do we make sure that the people who make those decisions know what they need to know? And so we got started at this at MIT in looking around and realizing that the people who wind up being developers, actually, usually sort of fall into it from something else and are never really educated to think about a whole set of issues, planning issues, design issues, construction issues. They pick up a lot of this stuff along the way. So there was a conscious decision at that point at MIT to think about how can we do a better job of educating people who are going to shape the environment and who are going to do so because they're the ones who hire the architects and the planners, or they work with them, but they also control the resources to do it. And we wanted to educate a group of people who were more sensitive to the kinds of issues that I was just discussing. So, and again, I started on the environmental stuff well before I did the real estate stuff. Real estate stuff I backed into because the people who were interested in reading my book about facility siting and those who were interested in reading the book on environmental dispute resolution were people who wanted to build things like prisons and airports and hazardous waste facilities, but also people who wanted to build regional shopping centers. And people who wanted to build multifamily housing in places where people sort of said, no, not here.
Right.
So,
well, that's a perfect way to follow up on an early book you did on trade and the environment. And given the current day disputes about trade and trade policy in general, are you thinking at all about that these days?
Well, these days I tend to think, we were just talking about this on the way in, at 74 I'm largely retired. And I think a lot more about my grandchildren than I do about trade policy in the environment. But I think in an economy that up until recently was increasingly globalized, one of the things which we have to worry about is a race to the bottom in terms of how we think about preserving natural resources and habitat and other things in ways that don't encourage individual jurisdictions just by virtue of competition to sort of be the most intensive exploiter of the resources that are at their disposal.
And then the international workforce, there's...
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the disposable
all
part
of the
all
above,
that.
right. So
we are meeting at a time that the UN is convening a group in, I believe in Brazil, opening today. So you've taught environmental studies for 24 years. I mean, you did teach it for 24 years.
Correct.
So today, what are your passions? Are they the same? What are your takeaways? And are you optimistic or pessimistic about the work needed to reverse course in the world?
Oh, that's a tough one. By nature, I'm an optimist. I always say it's difficult to lead unless you can persuade people that the future is going to be better than the present. Right. Follow me because we're going down is not a winning proposition for leadership. So I think by nature, I'm an optimist. And by nature, I mean, if you're an optimist, you almost have to be an activist.
Right.
Because it means that you're not going to leave it to everybody else to figure out how to make things better. And, I think that I've yet to meet anybody in the world of any political persuasion who thinks that the world that we live in is perfect. Okay? It's an imperfect world. And I always say to people that if you don't think it's perfect, then it's up to each and every one of us to try and repair it. Now, we may have different views of what constitutes better, but at least if we can recognize that it's our responsibility to make the world a better place, okay, then now we know what the agenda is. How do we make it better? And then how do we make it better for who? Or for whom? And herein I think lies one of the fundamental tensions between sort of, as we've talked at times about sustainability and development. Because in all these, there are deeply rooted ethical questions about the obligations of sort of one generation to future generations, issues of intertemporal equity, intergenerational equity, but also equity in the moment across, geographically.
Right.
So I guess I'm an optimist because I still think that the reason that, I did what I did, and I suspect what attracts all of you to study what you are studying or to teach what you're teaching is a belief that we can do better and that we should do better. Okay? Well, so that's our marching order. So, I'm not willing to give up. That said, we're having this conversation at a particular moment in time in which it takes a lot more energy to sustain optimism than it might have at other points in time. But even there, I take the long view. I like to point out to people that the nation has been deeply divided before. We've seen it in our lifetime. All you have to do is look at the 60s, the 1860s, or the 1960s. And in each case, we managed to sort of come back together again. And I think we will as well, which is why it's important, I think, to take the long view. So I try to take the long view, and I would encourage all of you to also take the long view because it's too depressing to just look at things purely in a short-term basis.
Well, one of the issues around the word sustainability or environmental resilience is you could go in many different directions. Mm-hmm. So if you had to lift up a couple of things, because these students in this room, just like ones you've taught in other institutions, they want to make it happen.
Yeah.
They want to change the world. So where would you start?
Well, so I think, when you're talking to people about abstract concepts, sometimes it's really, really useful to sort of bring them right back home. I once thought it would be interesting to go back and take a look, and now it's possible, at the use of the word sustainable development. Because in the early part of my career, people didn't talk about sustainable development as a phrase. That sort of starts to occur in the 1980s, early 1980s. Is that about right?
Yeah. Well, I don't remember, actually. I was so young.
Yes.
I think I'm not even sure I was born, actually.
Yeah, so. But the concept has existed, forever. So, and, all you have to do is think about phrases that, we use all the time. Don't eat the seed corn, right? Don't eat the seed corn is a concept of sustainability. And, everybody sort of says, yeah, don't eat the seed corn. Everybody understands that because if you eat the seed corn, there's going to be no more corn in the future. I mean, if you go back and look at the Old Testament, Leviticus, it talks about letting the land lie fallow 1 year out of every 7. It's a concept of sustainability. You need to give the land an opportunity to recover. Also embedded that, you let it lie fallow because there's still going to be things growing, and the people who don't own the land are going to need to eat. And so there's an opportunity for them to do it as well. I think trying to point out to people that these are concepts that we've understood sort of forever, literally, as long as humanity has been on the face of the earth. But now we understand them in different dimensions, right? Because we have the capacity to do things like to model certain behaviors that are likely to have consequences down the road. Consequences when we ourselves may no longer be here, but people that we should care about will, whether or not they're going to be, my children or my grandchildren or your kids or grandchildren, for those of you who don't have any kids yet, or even for future generations. And so I think, I had a law professor who said to me, I can win any argument I want as long as you let me frame the question. Right? So framing the question in terms that allow people to recognize something as familiar, which otherwise might seem distant, to understand that you're not talking necessarily about something new. You're just recognizing something that has been innate in human nature for generations, for centuries, for millennia. I think helps to be able to engage people in ways that we need to find new ways to talk to people about these things. And we also need to talk to people about them with humility. Approaching somebody and sort of saying, I'm right and you're wrong, also not a winning proposition. One of the mistakes that I think people make in trying to deal with these issues, or almost any kind of disputes, is they spend too much time talking to their friends and not enough time talking to their enemies. But here I would say not necessarily enemies, but people who think differently from them. And, I used to say to students who would come into my office when I was president and sort of pound the table and telling me all the things that I was doing wrong, and how they wanted to change the world, and if only I would listen. And I would turn around and I would ask them, you've made a really interesting argument, but let me ask you a question. You want to change the world. You don't change the world unless you succeed in changing other people's minds. Have you ever changed your own? Because if you don't know what it's like to change your mind yourself, you're unlikely to be able to help somebody else to change theirs. So I think that, again, if you want to make a difference in the world, you have to approach what you do with humility. You have to recognize that you don't have all the answers. You have to recognize that perfect is the enemy of the good. You have to recognize that you're likely to be wrong frequently. And this is why it's important to engage people who think differently. And, you need to be willing to change your mind. Because that's what good people do when they realize they're wrong, is they change their mind. And if you've never changed your mind, you probably don't, I'm sorry, fall into at least my category of being a good person. Because nobody springs from the womb knowing everything.
I agree with that, for sure. Which gets me to the next...
disagree with me. Come on.
No. No. Not yet. Just
okay,
wait.
All right.
We'll get there. We'll get there. So the next topic is about what we do. Because we talk about, in this building and many buildings around colleges and university campuses, it's theory or it's a practicum or it's this or that. But the question is, what do we do to begin to change people's minds and frame those questions? So two women who I have admired a lot over the years, one being Hannah Arendt, who wrote in Men in Dark Times, we have the right to expect illumination, and that illumination often comes from the flickering lights of men and women who basically continue to do the work, which really gets at Larry's last point. The other person, and some of you have heard me call this particular situation out, is Rosa Parks, because Rosa Parks knew when to stand up and when to sit down. And so even in the last days, and she moved from Alabama to Detroit after after 1955, but she came to UVA and in about 1990, and you could not get in the room. So many people recognized that kind of courage and sense of responsibility. So here's the easy question. What do, as people are coming out of university, or even those of us who just want to change it, what are the qualities? You mentioned framing, you mentioned don't be right all the time. What else is it?
When I say don't be right, recognize when you're wrong.
Okay.
It's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
you want to be right all the time, but you're not going to be. So just recognize.
So, and one of the things I hear from students, and you probably do too, is give us some good news here. What can we actually do about not just climate change and sustainability, but poverty, many of the systemic issues we face? So what kind of qualities, and I frame this as, we're not talking about maintenance here. We're talking, and not efficiency. We're talking about active participation and moving forward.
Right. So, I think very few people are going to change the world at the level of Rosa Parks. Okay? And if you set that out as your goal, I mean, trust me, the world needs people like that. So I don't want to discourage you from aiming high. But I also think that you need to sustain yourself. And one of the ways in which you sustain yourself is by looking for ways to make the world a better place a little bit at a time. And so, if you want to devote your life to dealing with issues of poverty, important to think about these issues on a systemic level and do the kind of hard work and research to inform policy about that. But also, it feels good to help people who are hungry at a micro level. Okay, and it not only feels good for you, it really helps them. So I think that we're constantly trying to operate on multiple levels, sort of the macro and the micro. And if you can do that, then I think it's easier to sustain the effort for sort of pushing that big rock up the hill for dealing with the really, really tough long-term issues, because you're seeing at a much smaller level how you can make a difference in individual people's lives. Yeah. And otherwise, it's very, very easy to get discouraged. I mean, I was actually talking earlier today to your current president. We were talking a little bit about how tough these jobs are. Trust me, running a university at any time is a tough job, but it's a particularly challenging job now. And I asked Paul, who I actually encountered when he was an undergraduate and I was teaching at MIT.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I chaired the pre-law advisory council at MIT, and he was thinking about going to law school. He came to me for advice, and he still went to law school. But we were talking about this, and I said, so, what are you doing to sustain yourself through all this? And one of the things he said, and I got this immediately, he said, I try and make a point of meeting with students every week in one form or another. And, it reminds us all why we are here, why we do the work that we do. And, one of the wonderful things, I've spent literally my entire adult life on a college campus, either working on it or living on one for a long time. When you're president, you live on a campus. And I always say one of the wonderful things about doing that is it's one of the few jobs where you get older, but the people around you stay the same age. And it helps keep you young, but it is I think everybody needs to sort of find a way to nourish their own soul. And in part, we do that by doing things that make a difference, that make us feel good about how we are spending our own time. And so, it's the kinds of problems that I've worked on for most of my life, the big problems, I'd like to think that, my scholarship has made a difference at the margin. But guess what? You can still, if all of you want to work on the same problems, there's plenty. I've left plenty for you to do. They're not solved, right? But on a micro level, yeah, I can point to some people whose lives are fundamentally different because I had the privilege of working with them. So I think, if you can find a way to operate on both levels, you'll do the long-term stuff better, and you'll feel better on a daily basis also for what you're contributing.
Before we get to immigration, say a word about the comment you made once about being the accidental president.
Oh, yeah. I avoided academic administration like the plague for 21 of my 24 years at MIT. I became a president without ever being a department chair or a dean. I just love being a faculty member. I like teaching my students and doing my research. And then I sort of got tapped by the president, who the provost at MIT had stepped down, and Chuck was looking for a new provost. And MIT is very centrally organized. It's the most centrally organized university on the planet. And everything ran through the provost's office, and we were burning out provosts. And Chuck decided he wanted two of us to replace the current provost. And so he asked me if I would take on the half of the job. And he asked my colleague, Bob Brown, who was I was chair of the faculty at MIT at the time, which is not actually an administrative job. Sort of like being shop steward of the faculty. And Bob was the dean of engineering at the time. And he asked the two of us to take on the job of provost, and he gave us the responsibility of dividing up the job into two, which was interesting. And so, at that point, MIT had been really good to me. I'd been an undergraduate at MIT. I'd been a faculty member there. The president asked, I stood up and I saluted. And if you have the number 2 job at a place like MIT, you get called for every presidency in the country. And I didn't think I wanted to be president, so I kept saying no until, it's a long story, but I agreed to have a conversation with some folks at Tufts. And I woke up one day and I was president.
Yep. So how easy it is just to go from undergraduate school to being the president. But that's a perfect segue to the third question, and then we'll turn to the audience. As I mentioned earlier, cities have always had this aspirational notion of Emma Lazarus' poem about, as I said earlier, the tired, the poor, the huddled masses. And they were places that we hoped people would get a second chance or even a first chance for a better life through education and opportunity and freedom. Your parents were immigrants, refugees, and their son became the president of Harvard. And America's openness to newcomers made all the difference. Those two for sure. Mm-hmm. So if you're comfortable, talk a little bit about immigration in your own terms, about your parents and what that meant to have a city and a nation that welcomed them.
Thank you. Well, so both of my parents came to this country as refugees. My father was born in Minsk, and his family left before World War II to escape the pogroms of Eastern Europe. My father always said his earliest memory as a child was lying in a ditch, hiding from the Cossacks as they came through the town, sort of torching the homes of Jews and then slaughtering those who ran from the flames. My mother was a survivor of Auschwitz. She was the only member of her family who survived. And in fact, of the 120 Jews who were all deported on the same day, September 14th, 1942, to the concentration camps, she was the only one who survived. She was 15 when she went off first to Theresienstadt and then to Auschwitz, and 18 when she was liberated by the Russians. And when I was named president of Harvard, actually there's an interesting story here, if I can.
Oh.
I was on the Harvard Corporation. Board of Trustees when we went looking for a president to succeed Drew Faust, who was stepping down as president. And the members of the corporation basically constituted the search committee. So I was on the search committee. And there came a point in the search when my colleagues turned to me and said, we'd like you to step off the committee and become a candidate. And I really, I've been president of Tufts for 10 years. I had already stepped down from Tufts. I was once again enjoying a quieter, simpler life, and sort of doing some writing and teaching and doing all the things which I was looking forward to getting back to. And, I thought long and hard about it, and the 45th president was already president, and I knew it was going to be a tough time for higher education. And Adele and I talked about it a lot, and I agreed to step off the committee and become a candidate. So here's the story. So I go to my first meeting as a candidate, okay, where I'm invited to sit with the search committee. Now remember, I was sitting on the other side of the table up until then. And so we were meeting in New York to avoid the prying eyes of the Harvard Crimson, which was trying to scoop the search, right? Young Woodward and Bernsteins trying to figure out who we're going to hire. And so I come in and I sit down in sort of the lobby of this. We're meeting at the office of one of the corporation members in Lower Manhattan. And the committee files in and they all say, hi, Larry, and they go into a conference room and shut the door. And I'm sitting there twiddling my thumbs. It's sort of awkward, okay, when are they going to call me in? So they call me in to interview me. And David Rubenstein, who was a member of the committee, asks the first question. David does a lot of interviews on TV. He's a really interesting guy. And David said to me, Larry, people think that you were a very good president of Tufts. I said, thank you very much. He said, you did it for 10 years. You got a lot done. You emerged with your reputation intact. You did a great job. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, where is this going? And then he said, this is a really hard job at a really tough time, and success is not guaranteed. You could crash and burn. Why would you want to take this on at the age of 67, okay, and put your reputation at risk? And at that point, this conference room had a glass wall, and it's facing south, overlooking the Statue of Liberty, where Emma Lazarus's poem is written. And by the way, when I was in elementary school, we all had to memorize that poem. I can still recite it. But also, I looked over, and we were overlooking the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And I remember what I said to David at the time. I said, if you look down over there, you'll see the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And I said, my mother arrived on the second Liberty ship. A Liberty ship was a troop ship that brought refugees from Europe after World War II. And if you arrived on a troop ship, you didn't go through Ellis Island. You went to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, because that's where Navy ships put in. And I explained that, she had lost her entire family, her entire community. She was the only one who survived. And I said, where else in the world can you go literally in one generation from off the boat with nothing, one suitcase? My mother was an orphan, to enjoy the kind of life and opportunity that I've enjoyed. And it is higher education that's made that possible. And it was the fact that this country opened its doors to my parents and gave them sort of an opportunity. And I said I was willing to take this job on because I wanted to ensure that future generations had the same kind of opportunity that I did. So, I think that, look, we're all products of our own experience. And in my case, English was the second language spoken in my home, and my parents, it was the only common language that my parents spoke. Seeing how difficult we've made it in this country for immigrants to come here, for refugees to come here. We would not literally be having this conversation if the same policies had been in effect. When my parents came to this country, I was interviewed at one point on All Things Considered by Mary Louise Kelly, who asked me about this. This is after I went to bat to try and get a first-year student from Harvard who had grown up in a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon and gets accepted to Harvard College, okay, and has never been out of Lebanon in his life, had never seen the place, gets on a plane, to come start his first year as a college student at Harvard, and gets turned away at Logan Airport and put on the next plane back. Okay, and we went to bat to get him back in the country, which we did. And so Mary Louise was asking me about this, and I sort of said, well, right now this country is privileging those people who speak English, have demonstrable skills that are needed, and who have sufficient resources to pay for their own health insurance, which most Americans can't, by the way, and show that they won't be a ward of the state. And I said, had these policies been in effect, in 1947 when my mother came here, or whatever when my dad came here, I wouldn't be here today. So it's one of the reasons why I'm passionate about these issues, and it pains me to see where we are at the moment.
Absolutely.
Outside during the reception.
Yes, join me in thanking
Thank you.
Larry.